another visitor. Stay a while. Stay forever.
Ein Podcast über alte Spiele von zwei alten Männern. Stay Forever mit Gunnar Lott und Christian Schmidt.
Hello and welcome to a special episode of the Stay Forever podcast. Over the past weeks, we've been playing through the game Bat 2, The Koshan Conspiracy, a French game published by Ubisoft in 1992 and created by a studio called Computer Stream. Today, I am very happy to welcome the co-founder of Computer Stream, Hervé Lange. Hervé, so glad to have you on the show.
Hello, Christian. It's a pleasure to be here. And hello, everybody.
Before we dive into the history of your studio and your games, there's one thing that I need to ask. How do you pronounce the game? Is it BAT or B-A-T or something else entirely?
That's a great question. I think, in France, it was BAT because it was Bureau des Affaires Temporelles, which has been translated to Bureau of Astral Troubleshooters by the marketing department of Ubisoft. And I think in the US, they said B-A-T all the time. So, I'm correct with the two pronunciations.
Okay, then I'll go with BAT, also because that's much easier for me to say. So, Hervé, you were the designer and writer for the games BAT and BAT 2. These two will be our primary topics today, but they were not the first games that you made. How did you get started in the games industry, and what did you do prior to BAT?
So I started in the game industry in 1984. Actually, in 1982, when my brother purchased an Oric 1, one of the very early microcomputers. And I started right away to write programs, games. I was studying, electronics at school. And my brother, Thierry, met Ubisoft I think it was in a shop in Paris somewhere. And they were looking for developers. And I jumped right away. I wrote their second game. It was Fer et Flamme or Iron and Flames. It was a role-playing game on Amstrad CPC. It was quite successful. So this convinced my parents that I could continue to stay very late at night doing some programming and design. And at the same time, working at school, preparing my engineering degree. So it was an amazing time. It was as simple as that. For Fer et Flamme, I was doing everything. I was doing the design, I was doing the programming on Amstrad CPC, I was doing the graphics, a bit of the sounds. It was really, really a complete kind of job.
How did you go from working alone on Fer et Flamme to building the team that would then work on BAT?
We started to look at new computers coming on the market, like, Amiga and Atari ST. In France, Atari was the most popular, I would say, at the beginning. So when Atari came on the market, it was amazing to be able to start to use more colors than, the 4 colors I was using on Amstrad CPC. And so it started to be, I would not say a problem, but how you can do everything you have in your head alone. I never wanted to be alone, by the way. I like to work with people. So at school, I met Olivier Cordoleani. He was a graphic artist. At that time, Ubisoft was trying to do an Atari ST version of Fer et Flamme with another programmer. I didn't want to do the port. I wanted to do a new game instead, a cyberpunk game. I met Olivier and he started to do some graphics for Fer et Flamme. It was so good. I said, well, stop Fer et Flamme and join the team. And it started like that. When I started programming, I worked for a company called France Logiciel. And the founder was Philippe de Rambure. Philippe was mostly a businessman, but he was doing some programming. At that time, everybody was doing anything. So when we started with Olivier and myself, quickly I realized I need some help. Philippe was closing his company. So I said, yeah, Philippe, if you want to join the team, would be amazing. So, and it's important to also mention the fourth guy that worked on the game, Olivier Robin, another Olivier. He was at the same engineering school than myself and Olivier Cordoleani. And he was a musician, composer. He wanted to do games also. And we met. He had great ideas. And we said, join the team and do the music and all the sound effects because we wanted to have life on that side. And he came quickly saying, well, Atari ST is not so good. Look at the Amiga. It's much better in terms of quality. He said, yeah, but we are with Ubisoft and they prefer Atari for now. So we were in an electronic school. So why not develop something, And it's where we came with ideas to add capabilities to Atari ST on the audio side with a little cord to just try to match what you could do on an Amiga. We said, well, we would like very much to have that card, and it could be something you add or you buy additionally to the game. And Ubisoft wanted to have it in the game and wanted to also use that as a protection.
I think we should explain for our listeners who are not aware of the fact that the original Atari ST version of BAT came with a little piece of hardware in the box, a dongle that you plugged into the ST serial port, and that then acted like a simple sound card. So the ST had with that card 16 sound channels available instead of the normal 3. And as you mentioned, the card also served as a copy protection.
Yeah, I can add something on that. When I was doing my games on Amstrad CPC, Yves Guillemot, the president at that time of Ubisoft, told me, you sold 10,000 games in France. It's amazing. It's one of the most successful games we had on Amstrad CPC. But you have to know that there's 10,000 illegal copies also running the market. So you have been paid half what you should have been paid for your work. I remember that I never had bad feelings with pirates. I think people can play the game the way they want. But it was hurting because I would spend a lot of time and a lot of energy. And in the end, it's like, 50% of your salary is going away. So when we came back with the idea to put in the dongle, for us, it was more like improving the music. But for Ubisoft, it was a way that they can maybe handle that problem. But it became a problem for Abandonware because now it's hard to get a version of the game, I believe, that is working perfectly. So, it was not so much a good decision. But it was really not a kind of tentative to just block people. It was also to add more sounds.
So coming back to the origins of BAT, you assembled the team with the two Oliviers and Philippe, and that's when you founded Computer Stream?
No, so after Fairy Flamme, I wrote another game for Ubisoft called Anno Zemgara, another French game. It was less successful, but there was a kind of, I would say, good spirit. And so, Ubisoft said, we like your games, we want to work with you. So they offered me a room in their office. I said, I want to create something like a label. I don't want to have a company, but I want to have a label where I will have some kind of touch on games. So they said, cool, you will have not to pay the room. We pay the room, we pay the computers, just find some people. So we were all students living at home.
Where did the name Computer Stream come from and what does it mean?
I think the name Computer Stream came from me. It was about mixing the English title of Blade Runner from Philip K. Dick, Do Androids Dream of Shit. So the dream part was here, and there was a very famous RPG on paper, table RPG called Rêve de Dragon in France, Dragon's Dream. So it became Computer's Dream, what computers would like to have as a game. I think Olivier loved the name, and he did the logo, a C and a D. I don't know if at time we were thinking already of CDs. It was probably coming. Honestly, it was not very serious. We wanted to be recognized by our games more than the logo or the name. I think Ubisoft at that time, they were also pushing branding of developers. The chateau, the castle in Brittany, where they welcome a lot of developers and start to form some little groups. I think Ubisoft was saying that lone developers were not the future. They needed teams.
So were you working in that famous Ubisoft castle?
No, because of we were students. We didn't went to the chateau. We stayed in Paris. And I had to do my French military service. In France at that time, it was obligatory. You had to do your French military service. So I was...
Yeah, same in Germany.
Yeah. So I was sent in Speyer. How you call it?
Speyer.
Yes, for a year. And Olivier Cordolani he was somewhere else. He was in France, I think. But so we spent 1 year doing our military service. I had to manage when I was at school doing the games plus doing my studies. And when I was during that year, I had to do the game plus doing all the exercise we were asking for to do all the day.
So how did your collaboration work? Was there a lot of cooperative design and shared decision making, or was each of you working more or less independently on their parts of the game?
We were all working on our own stuff at home. And we were meeting, I think, 2 times per week. It could be in the office. It could be in my room. It could be in Olivier's room. And all weekend, we were spending the whole night together. For BAT 1. For BAT 2, it was after our studies. So we start to work more at Ubisoft.
Let's talk a bit more in depth about BAT. Hervé, the manual of the first BAT game states, quote, "No one can describe the type of game that BAT is," end quote. You as the creator seem to me to be the most qualified person to try regardless. So what type of game is BAT?
I would say I would qualify adventure RPG game.
Okay.
It's an RPG game with I would say, strong storyline. And saying that, and I'm saying the storyline is good, I'm saying, it's very present on the RPG side. Does that make sense?
Yes.
But it's not only an adventure game. It's not only an RPG. It's a world, and you have the impression to be immersed in a world. So I would say it's a kind of a very early sandbox game. And we were very proud of that. On the other hand, it was very tough to develop. So it was very complex because, that means the world in the background has its own processing and everything was in assembler. So it was quite tough to get all we wanted in the game.
What was your inspiration behind BAT?
At that time on Amiga, there was a company in the US called Cinemaware. They did amazing graphics and games. I was super inspired by that. But I found the game too simple. I wanted something more dynamic. So Olivier and myself started to craft what we called a dinorama in BAT. It was inspired a lot by comic books, but more dynamic. The idea is on the screen, you have always graphics everywhere. But because of the limitation of a machine, you can't have full screen graphics everywhere. So we started to craft a system where you play in part of a screen on graphics, but the other parts are telling a story.
The setting that you chose for BAT is science fiction with, I'd say, a darkish edge. It's leaning towards cyberpunk. So what inspired that setting?
Cyberpunk was what I wanted to do at the beginning. But Olivier Cordolani, he wanted to have more humor. He wanted to have something more, maybe in the vein of LucasArts games at that time, something less dark and more close to Star Wars with funny characters and things like that. So we blended a bit the two ideas, and so it became something which is a kind of positive cyberpunk, I would say. It's cyberpunk, but it's not dark. So it changed with the coming of Olivier, for sure.
Your partner, Olivier Cordolani, once said in an interview that BAT is a mixture of James Bond, Impossible Mission, Blade Runner, and Star Wars. That's a mouthful.
Yeah, maybe I don't know about Impossible Mission, but there was something of James Bond because, you're an agent and you have a mission and you have a bad guy. And in the second game with BAT 2, it's a bit more complex. No, I don't think it was the initial intention from my side to be inspired by James Bond. But at the end, it was the case. Just for you, Christian, I wrote a third BAT as a scenario.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and my goal was to write at least, I think, 6 and maybe 9, because the whole story of BAT from the beginning was that the agent discovered that the BAT itself, so that organization, they say they want a peaceful universe and they try to predict issues and they send agents. But the whole story I had in mind was, you discover more and more that this is not a good organization and they manipulate you.
It's very interesting that you say that the BAT agency is evil, because actually one of the things that surprised Gunnar and me is that the plot of BAT 2 is so cold and cynical. Our mission in the game is essentially industrial sabotage and then turns into straight up insurgency. So as an undercover operative, we are causing a revolution on what one may call a third world planet, but not because we want to topple the oppressive regime. That doesn't matter to us at all, but because we want to secure a valuable resource for our side. And that's all that we and our agency, BAT, care about. And all the collateral damage that we must cause is just accepted. So we had to think of the CIA's operations in Nicaragua, for instance, or the USA's interest in the oil in Kuwait and Iraq and the Gulf Wars. And that's an unusual story for a game to tell, one that does not cast us as the hero at all. How did that story come about?
Yeah, so even in BAT 1, you kill a bad guy, Vanguard, to get the resource. The roots of that, when you read the storyline at the beginning, in the manual, it's about ultra-capitalistic millionaires who can't stay on Earth because they get all the resources. So they build spacecraft, they discover a way to travel through space with black holes and the Einstein-Rosen singularity. But they don't know where they land in the end because it's black holes. So you have a very explosive type of universe where you don't even know where they are located in the universe, but you have these planets owned by millionaires and they recreate what we want. In Bat 2, they recreate a kind of ancient Rome plus cyberpunk kind of world. And it was, for me, the opening of every kind of ideas, any kind of amazing worlds, blending what I want. I always wanted also to blend the past and the future. So it was allowing me to do that. And in the end, they are super capitalistic. They want to own resources. And they use the bat as a tool for that. But at the beginning, you don't know. You have a mission, you do the mission, you succeed, and everybody is happy. But I think I wanted to introduce the third one. But you start to really realize that there's something wrong. And what you did before was helping not freedom, but was helping more these people to get more resources. And it was that idea. So I was not against capitalism, but I wanted just to bring the player back to think, why I'm doing that? Is it good or bad? I think good and bad is always a big question we have in the game industry, right? How much what the actions we're asking to players are, actually good one or actually, if you don't think and you do what has been asked in your mission, you may succeed, you may be very good, but is it really ethical? And I think it was getting there with that. If we have time one day, I will tell you about the third one, the scenario, if you're interested by that.
I'd be very much interested in that indeed. But now, if I look at Bat, I would say that the defining element of both Bat games in terms of gameplay is the variety of different systems that get mixed into each other here. And to be honest with you, Hervé, this was a boon and a bane for us. It was very exciting at first, and almost always we ended up being disappointed because so many of the systems in the games are actually hardly used or hardly useful. And it really pains me to say this, but I know very few games where there's such a huge gap between what the game wants to be and what it ended up being. Bat, for instance, wants to be an RPG, but the character attributes barely matter at all. It wants to be an exploration game with room for improvisation and multiple solutions to problems, but in reality, both games are pretty linear. There's really not that much to discover, and we regularly reach choke points where there's no way to progress unless we do exactly what the game wants us to do. So, through its systems, the game keeps making promises which it then doesn't keep.
I take the criticism very positively. I think, you're right. It was very ambitious, and the balance of the game is probably not very good. It's better on the second one because I think we put more time in trying to be sure that the alternative system you have could bring you some value. But the problem for these games at that time, it was so complex that we didn't have capabilities to really expose all of the stuff to players. So they have to figure out sometime. It may be not clear for sure, in a lot of time. So,
well, learning how the systems work was not really a problem for us because, that's kind of expected for games, especially of that era. And it may even be part of the fun once you started to understand how the game ticks. The much bigger problem in both Bat games is firstly balancing. As you already mentioned, many things are unnecessarily obscure or complicated. And secondly, even when you figured out how the systems work, there's often no use for them really. I think the most striking example is combat. Here's a list of all the combat-related systems in Bat 2. You have character skills such as reflexes and vitality. You have equipment, namely armor and weapons, including ammunition. You have companions who can participate in combat. You have a system of body damage, including your heartbeat and bleeding. And you have two different combat modes, the strategy combat mode and the arcade combat mode. So all of these pay into combat or are specifically built for combat even. So you would expect it to play a major role in the game. But in reality, in the first Bat game, you have to fight exactly 2 times. And in the second game, it's only a single fight that you need to do to progress in the story. And beyond that, there's no point or benefit in fighting at all.
Yeah, I think, we didn't want to have a storyline where people have to fight for that. We didn't want to have a game based on fighting, but it was part of the war for us. We didn't want to refuse violence. It was part of the universe. But the more you kill people, the more you become a bad guy. We create constantly in the game new characters. And so the more you kill people, the more we create policemen, for example. So going to fighting is bringing you to more and more fighting. So I don't recall how many times you have to fight in the first one and second. I think I'm surprised you say 2 and 1 because I think it's maybe a bit more.
In the first one, it's just the 2 bosses that you have to fight, that Mariko henchman guy and then the final boss. What was his name?
Yeah. In the first one, you're right, it's 2 because you have Rangor at the end and Merigo, his assistant in the middle. It was 2 fights you have to do. In the second one, it's only 1.
Yes, the only battle that you have to fight in the storyline is when you leave that company building in the industrial district. Valcor, I think was the name, where you discover the body of that manager who was murdered. And then when you go outside, you get ambushed by the guys who killed him. But that's really the only one.
But there's a gladiators also section, you know?
Yes, but that doesn't really count for me because that's an entirely different mini game in itself, and it doesn't use the normal combat mechanics at all. It's self-contained. But you're right, it is a combat part that you have to do in the second game, and there's no way around it. You have to fight in the arena. But you know, that's just another example of an additional system in that game. You already had 2 combat systems in the game, and then you added an entirely different third one to it. It made us wonder why and how this came about, because a game that's a mix of so many different elements, as the first Bat game is, for instance, not to mention the second one, sounds to me as if it grew organically to some extent. That is, you did not sit down at the concept stage and say, okay, this will be an adventure game with RPG elements and an arcade game and a 3D maze and a flight simulator and a programmable hand computer. But rather, you added many of these elements as you went along. Is that correct?
You're partially right. I think one thing to consider also is we wanted to have no end. Like when the game is finished, we wanted the players to go back to the game and continue to play. So it's why we added mini games. Mini-games are used for some alternative systems, as you said, and the goal was also that when you finish the game, the main storyline, you can go back and continue to have fun with the simulators or the mini-games. In Bat 2, it's even better because the mini-games are really games you can play with levels and stuff like that. So it was that. I think I agree what you said. We didn't craft everything from the beginning. Building the games, we added stuff, depending also, of the technical opportunities we had, because I wanted to do some stuff in the scenario, was not possible, so we replaced with something else, which was simpler.
Like what, for example?
I remember that, for example, the dance in Bat 1 was not planned at the beginning. I wanted to do something different. I don't recall exactly what, but we came up with a simple dance.
So for our listeners who haven't played Bat 1, it's a sequence where you essentially just have to press the left and right arrow keys alternately as quickly as possible so that your character performs dance moves on the dance floor at a club to impress a lady.
Yeah, so, it was simple. So I agree when you said it was very organic. It was very organic. And we bring back ideas from different people because we were stuck on some places. And some people, liked it very much. It was like that because it was just, I can do what I want. And if I don't want to play the whole thing because it's too complex, I don't understand what I have to do, I can still play with the game. And some people hated it. So, I would already say it was an experiment in a way, because I would not pretend to have done a great design. It was very experimental. And I, as I said, in my mind, I wanted to figure out a way to, you could say simulation, but we didn't try to simulate something. It was more like the ideas of bringing life to games. So the Biogame, it was really that with a storyline, which was very ambitious. And so, yeah, it's not perfect for sure, and I will not go against that.
It's not perfect, yes. But as you said, that conglomeration of gameplay systems that the Bat games are also makes them interesting. For instance, there's Bob, your ARM computer, which also contains a simple micro-programming language with which the player can automate some functions of the game. Why did you put that in?
RPGs was about a lot of numbers to understand the skills of your characters. I didn't want to have a lot of numbers. I wanted to represent that as something more fun. You're in a cyberpunk world, so it should be connected somewhere, and you have a computer on your arm. It can process this number for you, and you don't have to look at all these number all the times. And you can program what you want because you're interested at some time to some characteristic, and another time to other characteristic. You may have to translate languages because they have different languages and things like that. I think Bob, the computer on your arm, is the screen on top of the RPG in a way.
We were a bit confused because the Bob computer is essentially a customizable interface. It's used in both games to display contextual messages such as I'm hungry or the time is so-and-so and to translate the alien languages, etc. So, but that's essential information that could have just as well be provided by the user interface to begin with.
Yeah, I think, the goal was to let the player decide when he needs to manage some of the numbers. Like, for example, you have to eat, you have to sleep. It may be a bit tedious to do that. So you may have to do a program to help that, for example. What we wanted is that there's not one way to win the game. So one is more fighting, one is more maybe hiding and stealing stuff, or one is more like talking to characters. We may not have succeeded well on that. I totally accept that. But if you let players play like they want, you may let players define a bit more what kind of information they need. So it's why we introduced that language. It was a very simple language. I think I was inspired by Next Computer. There was a way to program with icons. I thought maybe it could be useful to also for players to start to understand programming in a way, things like that. But really it was about if you let players define the way they want to play or finish the game, you don't want to have too much information. You want to let players define which information they need.
Now, if we continue the list of systems in BAT, there's one in particular that we haven't really mentioned yet that puzzled us quite a bit, and that's the flight simulation part. In the first BAT, there's one flight simulation sequence near the end of the game, and in the second one, there are 4 different vehicle simulations, from a hover car on a street to a flying taxi over the city to a spaceship that allows you to go out to space. And the strange thing about that is that it uses a different technology than the rest of the game, namely 3D vector graphics. The entire RPG adventure part, that's all 2D pixel graphics. But then there's a 3D engine in there only for the flight part, which, let's face it, is not really essential for the game. It would have worked just as well without it. The more so because the flight sim is completely unconnected to any of the other game systems. It doesn't use your skills, for instance. It doesn't need any equipment or anything. So why on earth did you put that in?
So I think in France, they said it's too much. They said it's too much. And it may have been too much. So we wanted to have clear separation between the different places of the world. So it was like a bridge. And when you end up somewhere else, it's very different. So in BAT 2, in the Roma city, it's bigger. There are very clear suburbs. And we wanted to, when you travel, you take the plane. And when you arrive, you have a different feeling. It's very different. And in the first game, by the way, we had at least 2 simulators. One was the one in the desert at the end, and one was more in labyrinth or maze,
Yeah.
It was not really a 3D simulator, but it was very close to Dungeon Master, for example, in terms of gameplay. And so in the second one, we developed a 3D engine. So it was the same 3D engine used in different perspectives. We reused it for different simulators. We thought it was a good idea. Not sure it was a good idea. It was maybe too much. And by the way, I'm the responsible for it. It's my fault. As a designer, I wanted to blend different gameplay. And I thought it was a good idea. But I realized that people like to have one gameplay. You like to do adventure and you have a simulator. You don't want to drive a simulator. Why you have to do that? It was a problem. I agree, and I thought it was good. Now it's better with sandbox games. You can explore and jump onto a vehicle. At the time of that, we were not able to do that anyway. So, but I realized, BAT 2, some feedback I got was, well, it's too much simulators. I don't want to use these simulators. It's a weakness for sure.
The funny thing is that we didn't necessarily mind the flight simulators being there. In fact, I quite enjoyed the taxi part where you fly over the downtown of Roma 2. That part works well and it provides a nice overview of the city and it gave me a sense of location and I really appreciated that. The problem is more the lack of focus that comes with all of the parts in the game and the lack of connection between them. There's so much stuff in BAT. It's like a chocolate box of game systems. It's like, here, we have something for everyone. Take your pick. I think what is apparent if you look at both games is the enormous ambition that you had. I mean, the manuals for both games say things like the game can be considered a life simulation or it took 2 years to create one of the most perfected games of today. And the manuals promise incredible adventures. And I read that and I think, wow, these guys are selling this really well. They sound like they're proud of what they've created. But I guess you know that both games ultimately don't live up to this, that they're far from being perfected. So did you overreach?
Yeah, it's what I meant, that people, when they say it's too much and why not invest this time in building a better adventure game, for example, things like that. So, of course, it was hard to make all these things well integrated because it was so diverse at that time. I'm not comparing to the games today, but at that time it was so diverse. I think we were always thinking to have more ways for people to achieve the goal, but bringing more and more of these possibilities, they balance the game. So I certainly accept the critics that it's not well balanced, that some systems appear to be a bit not useful, and that we miss some points. We did our best, and we just learned also, I guess, how to make games because we were young also, so it was very passionate coding. And game design was not so much a theory, so we were adding a lot because of our passion. I like the analogy of a chocolate box because you may love some of them and you don't like other chocolates. If you don't have some kind of explanation which one may be interesting for you, it's a problem. We're a lot in that idea to offer to people lots of possibilities to play, lots of possibilities to solve the challenge with their own way. It was super ambitious. I agree. Maybe too much ambitious.
You know, I have a soft spot for French games of that era because they were often experimental. The French games of the late 80s and the early 90s have a certain reputation, and that is that they are often beautiful and even avant-garde, but tend to value style over substance. And I would consider both Bat games perfect cases in point, because they are visually impressive and intriguing in their mix of technologies and game systems and narrative ideas, but all of these elements don't come together very well. What do you think about this assessment?
I don't know, because for my case, I tried to mix both, to bring some substance on the table. And it was, for me, the kind of artificial intelligence mechanism, the biogame, on top of a storyline. And this is very hard because, you have something which has no rules in a way. So, yes, I think it was maybe not the right tool for make sure the substance is good. I would say I'm responsible for the substance and Olivier is responsible for the style. So I may have done a bad job and Olivier a very good job, We tried to match these two things, but I wanted so much to express the AI in the picture. And it was very hard because at that time we didn't have so much memory, and Olivier did an amazing job to add a lot of little animation. It's very visible on the Atari ST version of BAT because the Amiga and PC version of BAT 1 have been ported and they didn't have time to do everything. So it's lacking on audio, it's lacking on animation, but on the Atari ST1, there's so much little animation, and we developed a tool for that. So I would say, I don't think it was conscious to push the style versus the substance. We just maybe succeeded more on the style side and less on the substance side.
I was just wondering because games of that era were often produced with the home market in mind, and they thus tend to form specific archetypes and patterns according to the local audience's taste. Germany, for instance, at that time produced an unproportionally large amount of no-nonsense management games that tended to be rather dry, whereas France seemed to produce a lot of games that were visually vibrant and often surprising, but difficult to play.
I think what you said is very good because the critics we had was very hard on England, for example. It was really categorized as a French game. We sold a good couple of games, was good selling, but the articles were tough, saying, well, it's French, and these French are doing this kind of game. And we didn't want to do that. We didn't even know. We were just doing what was inside our heart and stomach. But, there's maybe something French in it. I agree, because when I'm looking at other games, it's sometimes, as you said, style on top of substance. But, I wanted as a designer that it's not like a linear storytelling thing. It's different ways to play, with life in it, and you're in front of your computer and there's a world living behind. So for me, this is the substance part. And I totally accept if people are saying you fail on that.
If I were you, I wouldn't worry about whether I failed or did a bad job, because at least you tried to achieve something new. And from what you've been telling me so far, Hervé, I can see that you had a vision for your game and that you were and are passionate about that vision. And I really respect that. You know, I liked what you said earlier, that the bad games were an experiment in a sense. And yeah, that experiments didn't succeed in the way that you may have imagined it would. But you know, one thing that we were really impressed with, for Bat 2 in particular, but which is also true for the first game, is the attempt to build a world. Bat 2 has a backstory which comes in its own separate manual. Its planet Shedishan and the capital Roma 2, they have a history. It has all of these references to Roman culture. It has institutions and celebrities. And you went out of your way to create a system of measurements and local coinage and a hierarchical caste system for Roma 2. All of that provides this wonderful illusion of a deep and interesting world. And in the first game, the manual has a dedicated section on the clothing style of the humans in Terrapolis and the fabrics and materials which are used. And again, that gives depth to this cyberpunky future place that we're exploring in the game. So yes, Bat may not be there among the top games of its time or its genre, but it most certainly is not your typical clone game or Me Too fare. It has its own distinctive style, both visually and in terms of gameplay, and that makes it interesting to this day.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. By the way, you know, if we come back how games were made, I think this is the kind of game where we like testing a lot because we had no testers. We were the testers also. You know, when you look at what Nintendo is doing, they spent the same time for testing than the time for building the game. It was the kind of game where you need that. And we're probably lacking a lot of the testing to just be sure we achieve what you're mentioning, that, you know, there's a good balance and that what's in the manual or the idea was reflecting on every part of the game. So for that kind of complex game, and again, I'm saying complex at that time, I'm not comparing to current games, because I've got a lot of respect for what is done now. But at that time, for that kind of platform and for the knowledge we had about game design, it was probably not enough testing. So it was very organic. I think you said that, and it's very true. It was very organic to try to achieve that ideas in the end. And saying it's an experiment is a good thing because it was not some games we mastered in a way. It was more like, you know, trying to get somewhere with an idea.
You mentioned that the first game sold very well.
Yeah, it was very successful, even in the US, surprisingly, except we have to change a few scenes. But yes, Bat 1 went very well. Bat 2 was, do you know there was a CD-ROM version of Bat 2, The Koshan Conspiracy?
Yeah, that was your first project with your new company, Haiku Studios.
Yeah. So when we decided to move to build a company and to jump on the CD-ROM bandwagon, because it was allowing us to have more graphics and more stuff, and also because our studios were down, so we built a company, Haiku Studio, and the first contract was that we said to Ubisoft, we manage now our business, but we give you a CD-ROM version on PC for Bat 2. We did a pass on the game and add more animation and dialogues, and we were one of the earlier guys to adopt 3D Studio and do 3D cinematics. Olivier was knowing someone at Discrete Logic at that time, and he had a version of 3D Studio and he was able to create 3D cinematics, but it was not a big success.
So if the first game was successful and that came out in 1989, why did it take until 1992 before the second game followed? That's quite a long gap for that time.
I must say for Bat 2, I wrote the whole scenario, but we didn't do the game at the beginning. Computer Dream actually had a second team. We formed a second team to start to develop Bat 2, and we have another game in mind. The name was Xanatan, but it has been never released, so nobody knows about that. So we were on that, on Amiga, because I was in love with Amiga. I wanted absolutely to do Amiga. Ubisoft wanted us to continue on Atari ST and do Bat 2. I said, okay, I wrote the scenario when I was in the army, and I said, yes, I got the scenario, got everything, got the design. Now we need a team. I met a couple of students at my school, bring them back to Computer's Dream. I think it was 2 guys. Start the game, and we do the other game with the 4 members of Computer's Dream, initial members. but quickly they failed. It was not very good. So we jumped back to finish Bat 2 because it was more important for Ubisoft because they wanted to leverage Bat 1 as a brand. So we jumped back. I remember I wrote the whole Amiga version of Bat 2 almost alone, porting most of the code from Atari ST, the guy who was writing, and trying to convert all the graphics in like 4 months or 5 months because it was very, very late. And it was a big deception because Xanatan was very amazing and we were super excited about that, bringing more life, more animation also and things like that. So it was a hard decision to abandon that and move back in a hurry, to Bat 2. We did Bat 2 at the same time on PC, Atari ST and Amiga. And at that time, we were all in the same room because we had to deliver, very quickly the 3 versions.
Your story actually explains a lot. The fact that you were under this kind of time and production pressure in the end is probably a big factor in the game's lack of seamlessness and polish. That's a story that we keep hearing over and over again for those games in history which had intriguing ideas, but just didn't come together in the end. And it's most often the most trivial of explanations. We ran out of money, we ran out of time, we ran out of disk space.
Yeah, that's true. And it was a young industry, And even Ubisoft, there was not knowing exactly what's a good game. It was very opportunistic. The other game was working good, was not working bad. It was like, I've got 10 games, 2 will work. So even on their side, there was not real interest in make sure these games would be the best one. So they were relying on the creators. And of course, time was limited. And again, it was lucky for Bat 1 because we had to go to the French army and we were students at the same time. So, it was a rocky time for developing. But, to be very honest, Christian, even us, we were not knowing what is a good game. And we were trying stuff. And it was not possible to send the games to people, get feedback. It was just like you throw into the wild and cross fingers. And if you're lucky, you may do another game. So it was very, in French, I would say infantile, but I'm talking about France, by the way. Bat was quite successful in the US for a French game. And so I think in 1992, we were contacted by Activision. And they just have signed a contract for porting Blade Runner as a game. And so they contacted us, Computer's Dream, to say, are you interested? Because we have the guys from Infocom who did Return to Zork. They have an amazing language for building, crafting the games. But you guys, what you build in Bats with the animation system, there was a lot of life. They wanted to have that because in Zork, it was maybe a better story, but on the other side, less impression of life. So they wanted to blend this to build Blade Runner. So we spent 6 months in Los Angeles to start craft a Blade Runner game, bringing the tools I developed for Bat 2 and with the Infocom system. But they lost the contract. So we went back to France. It was a good experience because when we went to Activision, we just realized how much these guys were organized with pipelines, writers, And when we came back to France, we started to put that in place for Ico Studio. It was one. But, I think I just realized also how hard it is to just expose or visualize AIs. When you have an AI system in the background, you need to make it visible. And I think the problem in Bat 1, Bat 2, it's invisible. So people love the idea that there's a world. But at the same time, they don't like the idea that they don't understand what's going on.
You have a good point there. We played the second game for 8 weeks straight until we managed to finish it. And each of us put at least 30 or so hours into it. And so we really dove deeply into the game. We tried to understand its systems. We even went so far as to make an Excel sheet of the population of Roma 2 and their randomized inventory to calculate the drop rate of each type of item. And by the end, I think we had a pretty good understanding of the game and its systems. With one exception, and that are the stores in the game, because each store has an inventory of items that they sell, and that inventory is partially random, so some items may not be available right now, but they may become available later on, and so on. And that can also apply to quest items, such as the climbing gear, which you need to progress in the story, but the store just may not have it in stock right now. So you would have to wait for it to be restocked. But we never figured out what triggers that change in store inventory, because simply waiting in the game doesn't work. So we walked around and slept for days in the game world, and the store just wouldn't change the stock. And we just don't know how it works. That's a perfect example for a very frustrating intransparency in BAT 2.
Yeah, there's probably simple rules we put in place for that. But, we don't expose these rules. You and I, we just discussed about how the game could have been better, but maybe a missed opportunity for the Bob thing, that exposed more of the rules of the game. Yes. I didn't think about that, but it would have been a very good idea to just use that device to help people understand how they should act with some of the system. We missed that.
I agree. That would have been a wonderful use of the Bob ARM computer.
Yes.
There's actually one instance in the second game where you do have to use the Bob computer to reveal something when you use it to read the contents of a memory chip. But the fact that Bob can do that is never explained anywhere. And so that in itself is an intransparent system again. But speaking of understanding things, Gunnar and I were actually left with a few open questions when we had finished the game, the second game. And I thought I'd pose these questions to you. Maybe you can shed some light on them.
Yeah.
So the first thing is, if I take the spaceship and launch from the Astroport in Roma 2, I don't need to travel to space immediately. I can also first cruise around the surface of the planet and explore Roma 2 and its surroundings. And there's a lake next to the city. And next to that lake, there's one of the few 3D objects in the landscape. And that object is a giant electric guitar rammed into the ground. What is that?
Okay, so it's my fault. I was doing the modeling, and the tools we were using for 3D, for BAT 2, had names for famous guitar players. I was listening a lot of, Jimi Hendrix, Yngwie Malmsteen, Eddie Van Halen, and I think it's probably the guitar of Eddie Van Halen. I think Eddie was the tool we used for modeling. So I wrote the tools, and I was making the modeling of all these objects. And so I was listening to that music that was inspiring me a lot. And I wanted to put somewhere an Easter egg, I think. I don't think there's a function. You can do nothing with it, right?
Yeah, that's right.
It's an Easter egg, and I think it's the guitar of Eddie Van Halen.
So while we're speaking of 3D objects, there was another one of those that puzzled us. Because when you fly over Roma 2, you can also see that one prominent feature near the city is a volcano, which is also fully modeled. And there are not that many 3D models on the map, so naturally, as a player, you assume that the ones which are there have some kind of purpose. The more so because the volcano also features on the cover of the game. There's that guy in front of that futuristic cityscape, and in the background of that city is the volcano, which is just in the middle of an eruption. And in the city itself, in the game, there's at least one location, the park, where you can also see the volcano in the background. So because it's there all the time, we assume that the volcano would play a role at some point in the game, but it doesn't. We never got to the volcano. It never erupted. It just sits there.
I think it's one of the things we were not able to achieve. I think we are planning that the volcano is starting to be in eruption. And so time is limited, but we didn't achieve that. It was too difficult. We didn't know how to do that. There may be a reference to the ancient Rome and the Vesuve and everything, We use a graphic artist, a famous graphic artist for the cover of BAT 2. It was Royo, a Spanish graphic artist that Olivier Cordolani was loving a lot. And I think he did before we remove, that part of the story. I'm not sure, but we may have changed part of the design. Yeah.
Or that might actually already be the answer to my next question, because both games have a progress score, which we assume goes from 1 to 100 and indicates how much of the game we've played through. And at the end of BAT 2, when you're at the final puzzle, that score is 75. So if the maximum is indeed 100, we seem to be missing a quarter of the game. Was there another part planned?
No. I don't know. This one should have been 100%.
So it may be that we get the missing 25 points through solving that last puzzle.
Yeah, I don't recall how we compute the score, but the only thing maybe is that depending how you played the game, maybe...
so you mean we may have missed something?
Yeah, maybe something has been missed somewhere.
Okay, then I would be curious what that could be. But anyway, another thing that puzzled us is currency. In the first Bat game, you have two currencies and you can exchange one into the other, and both of them are useful. Now, Bat 2 also has a local currency, even with different kinds of Roman coins, but you can't pay with it. It's not used for anything. So we wondered whether that too is a relic of sorts, and you had originally intended to do something with that currency.
The Shedish, the population, the goal was that there's no value in this population. It's a kind of caste. So I think the intention here was to say the money has no value, you should not use it. But it was this kind of invisible intention where we didn't explain some of the things.
I see. The final unsolved question from our playthrough is one where I'm not sure whether you will remember the answer, but I'll try anyway. So our contact person on Shedishan is called Sylvia. We meet her in the beginning and then she gives us tasks throughout the first part of the game until she gets murdered. And then the second part of the game is about us getting blamed and thrown into prison and so on. And by the end of the game, we are pardoned, but we never learn who actually killed Sylvia. Do you remember?
I think it's a droid who killed her. I don't recall. Is it not explained in the...
No, there's no context on who killed her, or rather, who wanted her dead.
You mean not the one who did the murder, but who commanded the murder, right?
Right.
Yeah. I would be honest, I don't remember. It may be the bat, because it was a kind of idea I would have. As I said, the idea was that your bat was more manipulating agents and creating problems in the end than actually trying to save the universe.
Well, that's an interesting option that didn't cross our minds. But it did seem suspicious to us that when we were in prison and killed the Shedish king, who then turned out to be a droid, and suddenly we are proclaimed to be the new king, which all in all is a pretty surprising turn of events. And then immediately we get contacted by our superiors at BAT and they tell us hey, we kind of planned for that situation. Here's an alternative king that we happen to have already. And here's a complete plan of what you have to do next, because let's not forget, you're here to destroy the Koshan Company. And we thought that was ridiculous. But it's starting to make a lot more sense if BAT were the ones who got us thrown into prison to begin with. And they eliminate Sylvia as a liability at the same time.
Yeah, for me, it was a progressive story arc. So the first one is more like James Bond. The second one is more fuzzy a bit, it's more gray, but still, you're still an agent and solve a problem. And the third one I was on my mind was about where you start to understand you're, from the BAT perspective, not supposed to rebel or to not do what they want you to do. So I think in the second one, I wanted to start to bring back that idea that something is wrong, someone is manipulating, which is not the bad guy. And so it may have been that, but I'm not sure 100%. And anyway, I think Koshan Corporation, I think my mind was also something very close to that, so it was something like that.
This does sound intriguing. But so if you had such a clear vision for the overarching storyline of what essentially sounds like a franchise, why didn't you continue with BAT 3? Why instead move to graphic adventures with Down in the Dumps?
We didn't work on BAT 3 because, as I said, BAT 2 was not so successful. And I realized exactly what we discussed together, Christian, that's if I'm doing these big worlds, it's very long, and how I can really improve the visibility of that. And at the same time, 3D was coming on the market. CD-ROM was there with more graphics. We had 3D Studio. We were able to calculating more visuals. So we decided to focus more on graphics. So this was really style. You would be right. With Down in the Dumps, it was about the style. But also was Ubisoft. So as a company, we were signing with other companies like Philips Media or Virgin. And so it was not easy to continue to do that without Ubisoft. So the goal was to study this new technology, see where we can get more animation on the screen and possibilities in terms of graphics. But I started to work on another game, which was also very important for me. It was based on Wells, the island of Dr. Moreau. There's a doctor on an island is transforming humans into beasts, and is considered as a god. And it was an island with animals. They have rules. and the player is someone getting to the island, and the doctor is trying to control the animality of these creatures, and it's failing. It was very interesting because it was less complex than that in terms of the environment. It was an island and lots of creatures, and I thought it was the best place to start to revise the way AI could be exposed. So I don't want to talk too much because the game has not been released because for some problems we had with the market, I would say. But so I started to work on similar concepts, but we focused more on visuals. And then there was a big concentration on companies when consoles, bigger consoles like PlayStation 1 came over. So Morrow was coming from Sony, Psygnosis. They wanted to have very strong adventure games on PC, on CD-ROM. So we signed a contract and start to build the game. At the same time, we were developing Down in the Depths and also a 3D racing game for Philips Media called Demon Driver. And on my side, I was starting to craft that new game. And just a year and a half after, the PlayStation 1 came and changed completely the strategy at Sony. They wanted not anymore PC because they seen their console as a more important driver for the business. So they asked us to do a PlayStation 1 version of Dr. Moreau. And it was very hard because it was planned for the PC. And so that killed the game, mostly. We didn't succeed well on PlayStation 1 and they canceled the game. Philips Media closed just after because they were not successful on CDI and all that stuff. So iQOO closed also. I never had the possibility to do Bat 3. It was too late.
That's really unfortunate. What did you do after the end of Haiku Studios?
So, Haiku Studio was very hard because we had debts, we were paying all people. And so for a year, I had no money. But for these games, Morrow and another game I was planning, we developed a technology. It was based on 3D and splines. And we met some people in the movie industry. I wanted to do some CGI movies in France. They started to realize it was costing a lot, and they were looking to video games to prepare a movie, doing storyboarding in 3D, stuff like that. So we met these people, we showed the technology, we fell in love with the technology, it was very new, and they bought the technology. So for 4 years, I ran the R&D department of a studio called Durand Dubois. We made the Immortal, I don't know the name in English, by the way, it was the first computer graphics movie in France. And after that, I built a small company also, another company for the movie industry, leveraging game technology. And I went back to the game industry for a few years. I built some games for Behavior Interactive in Canada, work a bit for Warner, Ubisoft in Canada. I'm still in the computer graphics industry as a software architect for a company called Autodesk. They build the tools for most people doing games today, Max, Maya. Yeah.
So would you ever be interested in returning to the games industry and creating that third Bat game?
Yes, I'm thinking about that. But, I've got a family and I see where games are going. I would love to see more storytelling games. I think it's coming, but there's always a question that we try to address with Bat, how you tell a story in a fully interactive world. For example, when I'm looking at what Ubisoft is doing with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you have a kind of overarching story, but there's a lot of little missions you can do in the world. It's not far, I don't want to appear pretentious, but I think it's not far from the idea we had at the beginning. Well, I can say it differently also. Tolstoy, War and Peace. Tolstoy's War and Peace, it's about a main overarching story you have no control on. It's the war. Events are going on, and you're just a victim of it. But Tolstoy is not interested by that. It's Napoleon's invasion of Russia. He's not interested really by that. He's interested by all the little stories, all these characters that is forming a more social layer of stories. And I'm super interested by that. But you need that overarching story because you need to have big events and you have to change the world and the environments, and you need to stimulate the little stories. So I'm not super fan of Assassin's Creed in terms of the theme. There's too much combat for me, but I love the idea. And I'm happy to see that companies like Ubisoft are continuing to try to push these ideas about freedom in games plus stories, because stories is obviously something super important for everybody. So yeah, I'm thinking maybe, but my idea is how much they could actually be turned into a good game? It's still a good question.
Well, your ideas are fascinating, Hervé, and I appreciate that you shared them with us, because I now have a much better understanding of the vision that you had for the Bat games. And I do agree that many of the ideas that you had in mind for Bat, and which are already partially in the Bat games, are now commonplace in games, in particular in open world games. So, in a way, the Bat games have been maybe not trailblazers, but let's say precursors or early experiments of this kind of design. And that makes them notable, even if as games, or I can really only judge the second game because we've been playing that, it's less than perfect actually. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad game or that it doesn't have a place in history. I do think it has. And I know that there are people out there who adore the Bat games and consider them something like cult classics.
Yeah, that's true. And, David Cage, Quantic Dream, his first game, Omicron, was a tribute to Bat.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I met him in Paris maybe 4 years ago. I went to his office in Quantic Dream. He invited me. And when we sit down, he said, Hervé, I know you. I said, oh, yes. I think it was in London in a game show. And you were presenting Bat. And I was there. We shook hands. You showed me the game. I never forgot about that. I love the ideas. And he was saying, it's thank you for that. So I was amazed. I was saying, well, that's cool. Quantic Dreams and the games they are doing is, again, a kind of French style-based game. But, I was happy to see there were some people starting to finding a lineage between what we try to do in these early days and now.
Well, that's a wonderful compliment for your work and a pretty cool story that the Bat games link to the early work of David Cage. I, for one, am happy that we played Bat 2, and I'm particularly happy that you took the time to speak with us and shared your insights on the making of the game. It was both interesting and enlightening. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Hervé.